The panel tonight will be introduced by the foreign editor of The Sun, Mr. Price. We certainly are absolutely delighted with the number of panelists we have, the experience which they represent, and their expertise. It promises to be a magnificent evening. Mr. Price, as you know, has been twice the Middle East correspondent of The Sun. He's been with The Sun since '69. Since 1991, he's been the foreign editor. Mr. G. Jefferson Price.
Well, Frank, I'd like to thank you very much for letting us come on and put on. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. Well, first, I want to thank Frank for setting this up and allowing us to bring our correspondents here, let people know what they look like and hear them in person. They've all got very interesting tales to tell, and I'll try to make my comments short so we can get to that. I also want to thank Joe Stern, who started this thing 20 years ago, and makes me feel very humble every time I come in here and try to do it myself. And as I told Frank earlier, if I had my druthers, this thing would be called the Joseph R.L. Stern Baltimore Sun Annual. I'm also happy to see such a huge crowd out here. It really impresses me, and I hope that it impresses others, including our publisher, that there are lots of people who are interested in foreign news in Baltimore. Can you hear me now? You know, the other day, I was over at Heckinger's, and I was offered my first senior citizen discount. So bear with me because I'm getting a little old. It was, you know, bad news to realize that I actually look like I'm older than 55, which is all you have to be a senior citizen these days. But good news that you get the discount, so I'm planning on taking advantage of that. There are certain things that come with growing up and getting a little older and getting perhaps a little wiser, and one of the things I think is that I have a different perspective on things that are happening around the world and how my own country's behaving. And certainly, it's a different world than it was when I first started as a foreign correspondent. One of the things that I find is that I'm a little less cynical than I used to be, which may be a good thing in this age of instant news and the demand for instant reaction to unexpected crises. Reporters and analysts often tend to get suspicious and cynical about what the United States is up to in the conduct of its foreign policy. There's plenty of room for criticism of our actions, or the lack of action in some cases, in various parts of the world. Iraq and Cuba come to mind. So does the bombing of Sudan last year. One might even conclude that the U.S. is better at making peace than it is at making war. But I would argue that this is a good thing because of the many roles the U.S. plays. The role as peacemaker must be the most important. With peace comes prosperity, as we have all witnessed in the decades since the end of the Cold War. With prosperity comes stronger tendency toward democracy. With those three, peace, prosperity, and democracy, there is inevitably greater security for us and for the rest of the world. Not a bad way to end up, but it takes time and often a great deal of patience. One of the best examples of this verity is the Middle East peace process. Certainly the process is in trouble, always has been, but my senior citizenship enables me to put this much maligned process into some perspective. More than 25 years ago, I was sent by The Sun to cover the Middle East war in 1973. Egypt and Syria had attacked Israel, and Israel had beaten them both back. The battlegrounds were littered with bodies from all sides and the wreckage of war. Peace prospects looked dim. Israel held all of the Sinai Peninsula and seemed never likely to give it up. Ditto the West Bank and the Golan Heights. The idea of being able to make a telephone call from Jerusalem to Cairo in those days was unthinkable, let alone the idea of a peace treaty between Israel and any of the Arabs. The Palestinians were considered a band of terrorists who should not even be part of the dialogue if there were to be one. 25 years later, and that's not a long period of time in that part of the world, all of those pessimistic notions have been turned upside down. So when I hear of the dead, moribund, stalled, imperiled, and so forth Middle East peace process, I think back on how much actually has been accomplished and what an important role the United States played in peacemaking in that region. I'm optimistic about that place and other places where we try to be peacemakers, hard as it is sometimes to maintain the optimism. But peacemaking, to my mind, is the noblest and most fulfilling role we have to play in the world. Now, a final note about my age. When I was younger, I wished I'd been an adult in another time. I thought the 30s and the 40s would have been a great time to be a grown-up, a more exciting time in which to live. But I was wrong. This last decade has been extraordinarily exciting in some of the happiest and some of the unhappiest ways, ranging from the end of the Cold War and the collapse of communism to the resurgence of nationalism and tribalism in their most horrifying expressions. This century is ending with one hell of a wallop. Now, the people on this panel have been witnesses to some of the best and the worst of what's happened. It's been their job, sometimes under difficult and dangerous circumstances, to get the story of these events to you. And if I may make one more reference to age and perspective, I didn't realize it until I saw everybody here that Dan Berger was a London correspondent when the Troubles in Ireland began, and Bill Glauber, our London correspondent, has covered what we hope will be the end of those troubles. Let me tell you briefly who's here from left to right. Mark Matthews, our State Department correspondent. Bill Glauber, who is our London correspondent responsible for all of Europe, including the Balkans. And LoLordo, who is our Middle Eastern correspondent, lives in Jerusalem, but covers the entire region and just returned from 5 or 6 awful days in Baghdad. On my right is Will Englund, who is the Moscow correspondent. He's in his second tour as the Moscow correspondent. And speaking of historic moments in the decade, he certainly has seen them, including the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Dan Berger is an editorial writer, former foreign correspondent, and our expert on all foreign policy. So I think we'll... Where's Tom Bowman? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's the age thing. It's the age thing. Short-term memory loss. Who is that guy at the end of the table? His name is Tom Bowman. He is our very, very able Defense Department correspondent. So I think we'll start left to right with Mark Matthews.
Thank you, Jeff. Can everybody hear this? I'm going to try to talk a little bit about how the impeachment crisis appears to be affecting American foreign policy, and play just a little bit off of what Jeff said, both about peacemaking and a little bit about age. Last fall, on the same day that Kenneth Starr's report went out on the internet, President Clinton held forth at a joyous reception on the South Lawn of the White House, inside a tent where all the guests had been treated to drinks and hors d'oeuvre beforehand. And he received the Paul O'Dwyer Award for his peacemaking in Northern Ireland. By his own admission, he lapped up the praise and said that he and his wife, who was also there, don't want this ever to end. And he hung around long after others had left the dais. He reached out for hands to shake eagerly, almost hungrily. And there was a poignant moment when the sunset reflected off his hair and made it look much whiter than it ordinarily does. And he looked considerably older. In that brief frame, he looked, in fact, like a distinguished elder statesman. And I was reminded of this today when I was thinking about how the impeachment scandal has affected policymaking in Washington, and struck by the thought that he may never get the chance to achieve lasting enough successes so that he can be able to claim the mantle of elder statesman. In most ways, Washington policymaking is going on as though the scandal is really just part of the ongoing background noise, or even part of the furniture. And you see people at meetings and in photo ops, even sitting with the president while he was responding to questions, and they don't even shift uncomfortably in their chairs any longer. But there is an insidious effect nonetheless. It takes a strong president to stake out clear foreign policy goals and achieve them. Other countries, in weighing how they are going to respond to the United States, take the president's domestic political situation into account. Most major embassies have somebody close to the ambassador whose job it is to follow the ins and outs of political developments in Washington and report back to their capitals, and those capitals make assessments on how they respond to the United States depending on how strong or not strong they feel the president might be at any given moment. Sometimes being a peacemaker requires a president to take political risks, to be able to buck Congress, to be able to buck his own bureaucracy, or to be able to buck a very powerful domestic constituency. We've seen cases recently where President Clinton has had to hold back from taking those risks. At other times, the president has to be able to assert moral authority. For instance, in sending American troops overseas. And I think in recent weeks we've seen that on a number of fronts where the United States has been trying to manage long-term problems, it's either been running in place or losing ground. We've seen it with Iraq, with proliferation of weapons, with relations with Russia, particularly in trying to encourage reform there, as my colleagues will probably tell you, in Yugoslavia, North Korea, and with the Middle East peace process. I'd like to talk a little bit about Iraq to begin with, because I think that is really puts in a nutshell a lot of what seems to have happened. There is no question that the recent American cruise missile and bombing attacks on Iraq achieved substantial results. And they may very well have achieved the stated goals, but those goals were quite modest and quite vague. They were to degrade Saddam Hussein's capacity to develop more weapons of mass destruction and to threaten the region. Saddam Hussein is very much still there. We don't know if his regime is substantially weaker. His security forces were able to kill several hundred dissidents or opposition figures in recent weeks. And from the standpoint of international politics, the bombing left things worse than they were before. It's becoming clear that there was really no strategy for how Washington was going to follow up on the bombing raids. In the Security Council, American policy towards Iraq seems to have gotten less support than it had even as little as a year ago. when it comes to chemical and biological weapons, Saddam Hussein may in fact have the last laugh. He's been able to keep the inspectors from going back in, unscam the United Nations Weapons Commission could either be dismantled or defanged, and Russia and France, fellow members of the Security Council, are prepared to say, never mind. Let's stop trying to find out what Iraq developed in the past. Let's just prevent it from getting worse. And this could leave Iraq with the latent capacity to develop these weapons later on. Saddam Hussein does have the brain power, and he may still possess the ingredients and the spare parts. France and Russia are also eager to let Iraq resume pumping oil freely on the world market with fewer restrictions on how it spends the money. So two of the pillars that the United States maintained for a number of years to keep Iraq from posing a threat to the region are getting very shaky. These are the sanctions and the inspection regime. If the Iraqis have been testing Washington, so too have two other regimes, Yugoslavia and North Korea, and neither has been subtle about it. Slobodan Milosevic seems to be holding his increasingly desperate country together with the same kind of brutal nationalism that he inspired a few years ago in Bosnia. This time the location is Kosovo, home to ethnic Albanians and sacred ground for centuries to the Serbs. A number of people still worry that Kosovo could be the spark that ignites a region-wide war. Serb forces are suspected of a massacre in just the past few days. The reaction of NATO has been interesting. It's kind of a throwback to the first Clinton term. The United States can't get a consensus among other members of NATO for more than a warning at this point. If the warning is ignored or rejected, then we could see military action, but even that may not happen quickly. It could be a matter of days or weeks before it occurs. From overhead intelligence, the United States suspects that North Korea is digging deeply under a mountain. It's a country famous for building tunnels to develop a nuclear weapons production capability of some kind. I don't have good enough sources inside the intelligence community to tell me exactly what they know, but this much has been is widely known. Given this kind of provocation and the fact that an awful lot of effort has been put in the last 5 or 6 years in preventing North Korea from advancing its nuclear weapons capability, Washington's reaction has been very mild. They're basically saying, let us inspect it, and if you let us inspect it and we're satisfied with the results, then there could be a reward in terms of better relations with Washington. There is no suggestion at this point of much of a stick to go with that carrot. Past precedent suggests that if North Korea is definitely pursuing a weapons program, they will agree once again to freeze it or suspend it in exchange for concessions from the United States. But this would simply freeze something that could then be restarted later if North Korea chose. With the United States economy doing very well and the country not engaged in any major conflict, this would seem to be a time when an administration could spend some of its accumulated capital overseas and maybe launch a new initiative. But since the expansion of NATO was voted, Washington really has been reluctant to launch any foreign policy initiative that could be called one. We saw last year an attempt at opening better relations with Iran. So far, Iran has not responded, and this idea seems to have stalled. Just in the past couple of weeks, there is another tentative effort, but really a very tentative one, to obtain better ties, establish better ties, people-to-people ties with Cuba. But there has, again, been no stronger effort, perhaps, at eliminating the economic embargo against Cuba. So I think overall, you could conclude that at a time in a presidency when the person sitting in the Oval Office could be expected to take advantage of the fact that we're at overall peace, have no overriding adversary, and when the economy is doing well, take advantage of that and try to establish a lasting legacy. The president has been, I believe, too preoccupied or too politically insecure to pursue one. Thank you very much.
LoLordo was scribbling notes so furiously while Mark was speaking about Iraq especially, and I'm going to let her follow him. So, Anne, please.
Thank you. I was in Iraq for about 5 or 6 days at the end of December, and 2 days after I left there, I was on a plane to come home, and I was very happy to come home for the 2 weeks or 3 weeks that I've been here. But 1999 is going to be a very busy year for me, so I'm trying to rest up before I go back. But in my neck of the woods, we're going to see a lot of changes. It may be the year that we see a Palestinian state. We're certainly going to see, or there's the potential for us to see a new prime minister in Israel. Saddam Hussein, it's anybody's guess, and certainly not mine. I think he's here to stay, and I think Mark eloquently gave you the Washington view and also the effects of U.S. policy on Iraq. What I'm going to try and do is tell you a little bit about what it was like to be inside the country at the time that we were bombing Baghdad and the surrounding areas. Even though I was inside the country, my colleagues in Washington had a lot more information about how successful the United States and British strikes were, and actually how many people or the estimated numbers of people that were killed in those attacks. The press corps in Baghdad, despite what you might have seen on CNN, which might have made you think that we had great access and we got to see a terrific air show, which we did, but we were pretty much kept to the city of Baghdad itself. And we were almost always accompanied by a government, in the parlance, minder, who was to serve as our translator and take us to the various sites where the U.S. and British planes and cruise missiles had hit. More often than not, we were taken to see only the civilian sites that were hit, and at that, there weren't many. I was taken to see 2 small post offices, a house, and a huge crater-sized hole that was the result of a cruise missile that struck in one of the downtown areas of Baghdad. What I was never able to see was the military installations or sensitive types of buildings and institutions that the the Americans in Washington clearly said had been hit. The one time we were given, or were supposed to have access to something other than a civilian site, was on a trip, a 6-hour trip to the southern part of the country to a city called Basra. The trip came after, we had to leave at about 5 o'clock in the morning after a night of one of the more spectacular rounds of cruise missiles and bombs. And we drove down. There was a whole pack of us. The government was taking us, now mind you, they were taking us there. We had our escorts, and we were going to see an oil refinery that was supposedly hit. After we took us 6 hours to get there. When we got there, we were again shown these two small post offices that I mentioned earlier, one gentleman's partially destroyed house, and then we were supposed to go to the oil refinery. Well, we drove another 20 minutes, and the lead minder in the lead GMC Jeep waved us all over. We all pulled over to the side of the road, and we all got out wondering, did we make a wrong left-hand turn? Where are we? And we found out that he had gotten word that the oil refinery was not going to be made available to us. We were not going to be able to see it. And, there were probably 25 journalists there saying, well, why not? You're here taking us. We had permission to go. And the word had simply come down that the oil minister did not want us to see that site or see anything, even get past the gates or film it from the outside. And it was very clear to me that day and days subsequent to that, that the best story that I could really tell while I was there was to tell the story through the Iraqi people. They were the people that we had most access to. And at that, I want to remind you, usually I was with someone who was a member of the government who was doing the translating for me. But I think the thing that I saw most clearly in my 5 or 6 days there was, in my mind, the effects of U.S. policy on Iraq. As Mark said, the bombing, I frankly, from what I could see, didn't accomplish that much. I did see 2 buildings that were supposed to be, one was a military-industrial complex building, and another one was a headquarters for Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party, that I saw the cruise missiles very neatly hit and tunnel through and completely gut the buildings. But I also heard while I was there that people who might have been in those buildings and any sensitive documents that might have been in those buildings had been taken out of them days before. Tariq Aziz, one of the chief leaders of Iraq, who spoke to us while I was there, said unequivocally that the weapons inspectors would not be permitted back into Baghdad. And if the United States is as concerned about Saddam Hussein's ability to make chemical weapons, without having a strong and non-partisan group of inspectors in Iraq, I don't really know how we're going to accomplish that goal or keep an eye on him. What I saw mostly was the degradation of the Iraqi people because of the economic sanctions. And I met people who sold their libraries and their wife's jewelry and their family heirlooms in order to have enough money to put food on their tables. Now, I'm not my father, who is a very conservative Italian dentist, didn't raise a liberal lefty. That's me. But I have to say that from the people I spoke to and what I saw when I was there, I don't think that the U.S. goals are accomplishing their ends. If they want to change the regime in Baghdad, the way to do it is not to keep people, a very educated people, I might add, and very strong-willed and outspoken. It's not to keep them thinking only about how to keep food on their table or keep their kids in school or earn a living to pay their bills. a change in government isn't going to come from within that country until people are in a better shape to think clearly and think about other things than the bare necessities. I've seen in recent, I've been home now, but in reading in the last week or so, I know the U.S. has made a pitch through the United Nations to open up the oil sales with the condition that Iraq can sell as much oil as long as it goes for medical supplies, things that need to be done to keep the country on a more even keel. And I think that's a good first step. But I also feel that Saddam Hussein's ability to make chemical or biological weapons, we need to have a stronger or a more cogent policy on how to sort of keep him in check. The system as it stands right now, I don't believe works. The other thing that happened to me while I was in Iraq was I found that more and more, as the days went by, I was becoming an apologist for my government. Because people, while they never, I never had an incident while I was there in 5 days, while my government was bombing their country, I never really had anyone treat me unkindly, say a negative word to me, particularly being an American. I never felt threatened. But people always wanted to know why my government was doing what it was doing. They never saw that this was a problem having to do with Saddam Hussein. In fact, I think his popular support rose. They saw him as standing up to the West, and they had a lot of questions about what they feel was the uneven-handed American policy in the region. Probably one of my last conversations there was with a and I always got asked if I was an American. It was almost always the second question out of someone's mouth. But again, I think that people there never took aim at me personally or any of my colleagues that I know of while I was there, but really wanted some straightforward answers as to what American policy towards Iraq, what its end goal was. And I frankly couldn't provide that answer for them. My colleagues in Washington might have had a better answer. I think that people in Washington also may not always be getting the most accurate information about what the achievement, what our goals, if we achieved our goals when we were in Iraq. I can't measure whether we hit all the targets that the Pentagon said that we hit. I couldn't determine whether or not the number of casualties that the Iraqis claimed were a result of the strikes. I could never verify that. But I think that I hope anyway, if the President gets past his present troubles, that somebody in the White House or in the State Department will really take a very hard look at the way to bring that issue to a close in a way that not only achieves our goals, but enables the Iraqi people to get back on their feet.
And LoLordo is a war correspondent. Now we're going to go to Bill Glauber, who covers a land that is no longer at war and has finally come up with its own currency.
You could say that the 20th century, Europe was about O for the century. I mean, if you look at the world's problems, Europe made a hash of it. And so Europe is trying to end the century, making amends for what went wrong. But it's going to be very difficult. I'll give you an example. This is a fat, ugly, bulldog British plug. All right? This is a very sleek continental plug. For about 25 years, the people who run Europe tried to come up with a European plug. About a year and a half ago, they decided they couldn't do it. So there will be no European plug. And then let me show you something else. This is a Winnie the Pooh character that my kids picked up at a McDonald's in London. Now there's all this writing on this Winnie the Pooh character on this label here. And in 25 languages, it says, to avoid danger of suffocation, keep this bag from babies and children. 25 languages. As you all know, Euroland, it sounds like Disneyland. It's 11 countries, it's 290 million people. It has an economy roughly the size of the United States. But in many ways, it's a Tower of Babel. And in many ways, it's just disparate politicians all angling for their best interest, for their country's best interest. And right now, the euro, if you go to Europe, there's no such thing in your pocket. It's a virtual currency. It's going to remain a virtual currency until 2002, and then for 6 months, you're going to have euros along with francs and marks, and then eventually they'll phase out the national currency, and then it will be all euro all the time. And we in this room should hope that it succeeds, because if it doesn't succeed, then Europe will be in a lot of trouble, because these economies are now linked together in ways that would kind of upset us, because these governments no longer have full control over their budgets. They can't run deficits. They can't inflate. They have to really kowtow to the European Central Bank, and they have to cut a lot of political deals to make sure that this thing works. And it could be very difficult. I'll give you an example of why. For instance, Ireland now is the fastest growing country in Europe, the Celtic Tiger. It's got a 9% growth rate. But in order to come into the euro, they had to slash their interest rates, which would be the last thing you'd want to do with a growth rate of 9%. But the euro could work. And if it does work, it will bring benefits. It will lower prices. It will probably lower wages, which isn't necessarily a good thing, but it will make Europe more competitive. And I'd like to quote probably one of the most important men in Europe, and also one of the most important men in the United States, Jürgen Schrempp, who is the CEO of Daimler Chrysler. That's Daimler Chrysler. There's no such thing as Chrysler anymore. And he said the euro will unleash powerful market forces certain to transform the way Europeans live and work. The years ahead will bring increased efficiency, greater productivity, higher overall living standards, and lower unemployment. We can only hope that he's correct. I don't know if he is, and the great thing about the euro, at least right now, is it's kind of like baseball. It's nothing but an opinion in a lot of ways. And I'll just leave you with the last example. The first time I had to do a euro story was back in March, and I'm calling this expert and that expert to try to find out what this thing really was, what it was going to be about. And I talked to one of the foremost experts on the euro, and he put it succinctly: the euro changes everything, we just don't know what.
Good.
Well, now I'm going to give you Will Englund, who covers Russia, a country where they have their own currency problems.
I have in my pocket, unlike Euroland, Russia really does have a currency. And I have in my pocket a 50 ruble note, which is illegal to possess in this room, but I've got it anyway. In Russia, you're not allowed to take currency into, or that is to say rubles, into or out of the country. But when you come into the airport, before you get to customs, if you want to rent a baggage cart, it costs 50 rubles. That's why I've got it in my pocket today, and it's one of those contradictions that the Russians don't bother to address. I read in the paper the other day that it was 55 degrees below zero in a little logging town in northern Maine. And let me say, to any of you who have never had the pleasure of being in that kind of weather, that is very cold. I was recently in Chukotka, which is the part of Russia that's just across the Bering Strait from Alaska, where, unlike Maine, it isn't news when the weather gets that cold. It's like that all winter long. What's it like? When the wind isn't blowing, which is often the case, there's this sort of misty frost that's just hanging in the air, heavily juiced with car and truck exhaust. If you squeeze your nose like this, there's a very unsettling crackling noise that comes out of it. If you take a picture and squint one eye, you're likely not to be able to reopen it until you get indoors again. You think to yourself, if only I didn't have to breathe, I might be able to get through this. After I had spent a couple of days in this gold mining town called Bilibino, where it was this cold, I went to a town on the coast where it was only about 35 below. And I promptly got frostbite on my nose. Young man, this bossy old woman said to me on the street, wagging her finger, "You better cover up that nose." And she did save me from a real problem. Later on, I asked the doctor there why I had gotten frostbite at 35 below, where I'd been outdoors a great deal of the day earlier where it was so much colder. "Look," he said to me in all seriousness, "it's not the cold, it's the humidity." Now, this is a part of the world where the youth hockey season doesn't begin until the end of March because it's too dangerous to play outdoors before that. The ambitious governor out there formed a professional soccer team, but they play all their home games in Moscow, 4,600 miles away. The question I ask you, is this any place to have a city? To have schools and bus drivers and police stations and KGB bureaucrats and bank tellers and hockey coaches? The answer is niet. And everyone understands that now. It's just too cold. So Russia right now is pulling back. It's pulling back from the Far East, it's pulling back from the north, and it's pulling back from deepest Siberia. It simply can't afford what the Soviet Union had wrought. The whole country is contracting. But as you might expect, it's not going very smoothly. There's a village in Yakutia, which is in sort of deepest Siberia, that the government announced about a year ago would be shut down by fall. They've been doing this. They shut down 26 villages in Chukotka. The trusting people in this village didn't plant vegetables in their little greenhouses that they have out back. The cynics did. Somehow, the money to relocate these people went this way or went that way, and there was a dispute over which government agency was responsible, and I can report today that only the cynics in that little village have any vegetables. Coal miners north of Perm in the Ural Mountains lost their jobs last January. On paper, there's a government mechanism to help them relocate elsewhere in Russia. The miner is to get a scrap of paper informing the local authorities in the place that he moves to that he and his family are entitled to a certain kind of apartment. The local authorities provide this in theory, then they are reimbursed. Yeah, right. No one has moved, and it's understandable why no one has moved. Now, maybe you're thinking, here we go, more Russian misery. Haven't we heard enough? Well, let me try to show why I'm sort of getting into all this. Those of you who were here a year ago at this meeting heard my lovely, perceptive colleague, Kathy Lally, tell you about some of the things that had happened to friends of ours. The piano teacher whose entire savings were stolen, probably by her landlord. The woman who had to pay $8,000 to get her son out of the clutches of a corrupt police unit. The businessman, Nikolai Kolya, who had to shell out all his savings when mobsters told him he was responsible for a Mercedes that had been stolen. It's complicated. Just take my word for it. That's what happened. Let me bring you up to date on Kolya. In the spring, after Kathy was here, the tax police came to look at his books. He was running a business importing clothing from Turkey, saw what his turnover was, and demanded that he pay income tax on it. He tried to explain to them the difference between turnover and net profit, but they weren't in the slightest bit interested. It would have ruined him, except that the collapse of the ruble and the banking system in August ruined him first. Kolya was one of those honest businessmen who did what he was supposed to do, who dreamed about opening his own garment factory one day in Moscow, and who put his money in the bank. Now he's broke and owes $60,000 to his Turkish partner. Kolya's wife, Natalia, worked for Kelly Temps, their office in Moscow. She lost her job about 3 weeks into the crisis. But I can say there is a silver lining. Kolya has a background in broadcasting and has since landed a job with Danish radio as sort of like office manager in Moscow, although at $18,000 a year, it'll take them quite a while to pay off that debt. Natalia found a job right away with a South African company that has a license to brew Carlsberg beer. Her job is in Moscow, and in the meantime, they're building a brewery in a city called Kaluga, which is about an hour and a half, 2 hours outside of Moscow. This is one of those, Kaluga, that is to say, is one of those depressing places where the only industry is defense-related, which is to say that it's totally moribund. The factories aren't doing much of anything. The workers haven't been paid for a year or more. There are no prospects. There were no prospects until this brewery came along. This is going to be a genuine economic unit. You know, it'll be producing. It will have people working for it. Should make money. Just one thing, though. The brewery is having a terrible time persuading people to come to work for them, even though they're offering good cash wages paid on time. It's astonishing. But the workers are leery of anything run by foreigners, and they're completely reluctant to leave the collective they have known all their lives. I may be miserable, but we're all miserable together. Maybe someday they'll pay us again. These foreigners, they could pull up stakes at any time, and then where would I be? They can't get a workforce to work at this brewery. This is Russia today. This is the depressing reality. And you'll notice I haven't even mentioned Boris Yeltsin or the whole question of American food aid. It comes to this. Trust no one, have no hope. In this way, you won't get burned.
Tom Bowman is going to talk to us about Defense Department strategy and so forth.
I apologize. I don't have anything for show and tell tonight. The Pentagon wouldn't let me bring the cruise missile into the building. I had thought about talking about the national security environment for 1999 by suggesting that it's like Groundhog Day, the movie where the guy just, the same day over and over, you know, for quite some time. But I think a better parallel movie metaphor perhaps might be the year of living dangerously, because I think that's where we're headed in 1999. If you look at Iraq, what happened last year, we spent most of the year threatening Saddam Hussein, and then we ended the year with a 4-day bombing strike on Iraq. And we call it successful, yet he's shooting at US and British planes now. He's making more threats to Kuwait, and there are some intelligence analysts that suggest that he may lob a few missiles into Kuwait, particularly at an airfield which has 30 British Tornadoes parked there now. And if you look at certainly what's going on in Bosnia, just the recent headlines, we thought we had some sort of a truce last October. It's now descended just several months later into some bitter fighting. Some people thought that the Kosovars and the Serbs would at least hold out the winter and then start killing each other in the spring. But I think we're seeing that hatred is rearing its ugly head even in the dead of winter. North Korea, as Mark mentioned, is another serious issue for the United States. Last year, North Korea shot a 3-stage missile over Japan and is making, it is making similar threats to do other such things, I think, in this year as well. And even places like in Haiti, where we thought we had at least some sort of a, I don't know if you would call it Haiti back to where it used to be, but at least we thought that it was at least stable there. But now we see the president has decreed a new government, and we could be seeing some more refugee problems or perhaps bloodshed there as well. So the question is, what does this mean for the Defense Department? And one of the things it means, and I think you'll hear a lot about this year in Congress and the Pentagon and also at the White House, is that the number of the U.S. forces have decreased about 31% since the end of the Cold War. but the operations of the Pentagon have been increased 4 or 5-fold. There are a great number of strains on the Pentagon and on the forces as a result of this. I think that's a hugely serious issue that you'll hear quite a bit about this year. They've tried to address this, I think, by increasing the defense budget, by giving the soldiers and sailors and airmen more pay, better retirement benefits, but you're still seeing quite a drift from the military of experienced pilots and senior enlisted men as well. For example, the Air Force last year lost just over 1,000 pilots, and they cost $6 million apiece to train. Already this year, in the first few months of this fiscal year, 800 pilots have left or said they will leave. So I think we're going to see a serious problem there as well. It was funny, a couple of years back, Defense Secretary Cohen, at a meeting with reporters, talked about this problem of too many operations and what is in our interests in the world. We seem to be everywhere from the no-fly zones in Iraq to Bosnia, Macedonia. If there's a hurricane in Central America, we send thousands of troops. And he said that he believes that in the future years, we'll just have to say no, that we can't make it. He said that 2 years ago, and that was the first and last time I ever heard anyone in government say that. Thank you.
Dan Berger is the veteran Sun Man person at the table, and we're looking forward to hearing from him.
Well, I want to hear some questions of these other people. Jeff asked me to talk about the financial crisis in Asia, wherever Asia may be. And in conclusion, it's not over till it's over in Japan, in my opinion, because of Japan's indispensable role as the banker, the investor, and the importer of goods from the other countries concerned. In Tokyo today, in the parliament, the Economic Planning Agency minister talked about the national economic crisis in its worst post-war recession. The finance minister talked about an extremely severe slump. And Prime Minister Obuchi, who wanted to say something optimistic, said that he's confident that the economy will recover to around 0.5% growth in the fiscal year that will begin next April. So that's the optimistic view. The good news is that this sort of bust that follows booms, it's a disease of tigers that pussycats may be immune to. It has not brought down the world. It has not brought down our country. It has certainly harmed some interests here and harmed some people. But it's not over, and I don't know where it's going.
We'll take questions now. This is the first time I've ever tried to run one of these things. So, Frank, how do we do this? Is there some sort of protocol? I'm having a hard time seeing out there because of the lights. If there are
this question is for the whole panel, but mainly directed at Mr. Bowman and Mr. Matthews. The House Select National Security Committee released a report last week concerning tech transfer to China. And it seems preliminary reports of Christopher Cox's report seems it's going to bode pretty badly for anyone who endorses engagement in terms of foreign policy. I was wondering if you could comment on what you believe the policy implications will be from the outcome of that report.
What I think is going to happen is what has already happened, that technology transfers to China, in particular in the rocket launching and satellite launching realm, are going to get much closer scrutiny on the Hill, and probably the administration is going to be extremely reluctant to allow the same level of licenses that they allowed before. But as far as America's relationship with China, the trade relationship, and the political relationship, I think that there is enough bipartisan support for maintaining the status quo that it won't make all that great a difference.
Tom? And the other thing too is this has been going on for quite some time. Tech transfer. It's not a Clinton administration problem. It's been going on in previous administrations. And the other thing is, I don't think anyone really has a grasp of what effect this has on. The real concern, of course, is the Chinese military and whether or not this has helped them in any way. And I don't think anyone really has a grip on that yet. There's certainly great concern at the Pentagon by some of this, but no one has really given any detailed, in any detailed way about the effect of some of this transfer.
Can I get into this? Sure.
I think the U.S.'s biggest interest in China is in influencing its international conduct with respect particularly to relations with Taiwan, with respect to human rights, especially in Tibet, with respect to the nuclear arms race, with respect to proliferations in weapons transfers to third countries. And the way to exercise that influence is to maintain engagement, even when somebody will say, you're cynical about human rights or other things we don't like in China. And I believe that will continue for those reasons.
It'll always be frustrating that one simply cannot take advantage of all 7 of our participants as deeply and well as we would like. The positive side is that I think it's been a marvelous evening, very interesting, and insightful.